You need to understand what they took from me. Not just the house, not just the years. They took the version of myself that still believed family meant something unconditional. I gave 41 years to that marriage. 41 years of packed lunches and parent-teacher nights and staying up past midnight when my husband came home from the plant smelling like machine oil and exhaustion. I was the one who managed the household accounts, who kept the pantry stocked through the lean months, who learned to stretch a pot of soup 3 days in a row without anyone noticing. My name was Vivienne. I was 63 years old, and the morning my son told me I had 4 weeks to vacate the home I had lived in since 1987, I was standing in the kitchen making him coffee. He didn't even sit down. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, his coat still on, and he said it like he'd rehearsed it, like he practiced the exact tone that would make it sound reasonable. He said that he and his wife had been talking, that they needed more space now that the baby was coming, and that it made more sense for them to move into the house than to keep paying rent on their apartment in Mississauga. He said the commute was killing them. He said the house was too big for one person. He said he hoped I understood. 4 weeks. My husband Terence had been gone 14 months by then. I was still finding his reading glasses in odd places, tucked between couch cushions, balanced on the windowsill in the upstairs bathroom. And my son was standing in the kitchen telling me I had 4 weeks. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I didn't cry and I didn't raise my voice. I set his coffee on the counter and I said, very quietly, that I would think about it. He nodded like that meant yes. He kissed me on the cheek and he left for work. I stood at the kitchen sink for a long time after that. The yard was brown and frozen, the way it always looks in Brampton in late February. The bird feeder Terence had bolted to the cedar post was empty. I had forgotten to fill it. I remember thinking that I needed to fill it, and then I thought about how strange it was that I was standing in my own kitchen worrying about a bird feeder when the ground had just shifted beneath me. My daughter-in-law Chandranra called that evening. She was warmer about it than my son had been. She used the word together a lot, talked about how it would be good for the baby to have a grandmother in the house. But there was something underneath the warmth, a certainty, like the conversation had already happened and I had already agreed. She mentioned almost in passing that they'd already started telling people, their friends, her mother. I said I'd give them my answer by the weekend. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark in the bedroom Terence and I had shared for over 3 decades, and I tried to understand how I had arrived at this moment. I had no income of my own except for my CPP and OAES, a combined $1,400 and some a month, which sounds like money until you try to rent anything in the GTA. I had never worked full-time after my son was born. I had done bookkeeping here and there for a neighbor's cleaning business. I had volunteered. I had raised a child and managed a home and done everything that needed doing without ever calling at work. Terence had handled the money, not because I couldn't, but because it was easier that way, and because I had trusted him completely, and because I was 63 years old and I had never once thought I would need to know where everything was. That was my first mistake, trusting that things would always be the way they were. By Friday, I had called 2 rental agencies and looked at 4 apartments online. The cheapest was a basement unit in Brampton, $1,200 a month. No laundry in suite, a photo that clearly had a water stain cropped out of the frame. I would have had $200 left over each month for food, for bus fare, for the prescriptions I take for my blood pressure, for everything. I told my son on Sunday morning that I would start making arrangements. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a week. I began going through Terence's things that same afternoon. not because I was ready, because I needed something to do with my hands. His closet first. The suits he'd worn maybe 6 times total, the winter coats, the cardboard boxes on the top shelf that I had always meant to sort through and never had. The second box from the left had a rubber band around it. Inside was a manila envelope with my name written on the front in Terrence's handwriting, not typed, handwritten, with the pen he kept on his nightstand, the one with the blue grip that I used to steal and he used to pretend to be annoyed about. I sat down on the floor of the closet with the envelope in my lap. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, front and back, dated 18 months before he died. He had written it longhand, which meant it had taken him a while, because Terrence's handwriting was careful and slow. He always said cursive was just typing for people who had time. The letter started, "Vivienne, if you're reading this, I didn't get to tell you in person, and I'm sorry for that." I read it twice before I understood what it said. Terrence had spent the last 4 years of his life quietly restructuring things. He had watched his own father be moved into a care home by an aunt who controlled the finances, watched it happen fast and without dignity, and it had scared him in a way he said he'd never been able to put into words. So he had done what he could. He'd added my name to the title of the house, had done it in 2020, quietly, through the same lawyer who had handled the purchase back in 1987. He had also opened a joint investment account in both our names at a TD branch in Oakville, a branch I had never been to, in a city I had no reason to visit because he had done it on a day he told me he was going to a union meeting. The account had been accumulating for 11 years. There was a second envelope underneath the letter. Inside were account statements, a passbook, and a card from the lawyer's office with a handwritten note that said, "Call us when you need to. We're expecting to hear from you." I sat on the floor of that closet until the light through the window changed. The amount in the investment account was $247,000. I want to tell you something about what it feels like to discover your own financial life at 63. It is not joy, exactly. It is not relief. It is something stranger than both of those things, a kind of vertigo, like finding a door in a wall you had looked at every day for decades and never noticed. All I could think was, Terrence. All I could think was that he had known. He had known, without saying so, that I might someday be sitting exactly where I was sitting, and he had made sure I would not be helpless. I called the lawyer's office the next morning. Her name was Adrienne, and she had apparently spoken to Terrence several times over the years. She walked me through everything on the phone, patient and unhurried. Yes, the title to the house had been updated. Yes, it was in both names. Yes, this meant that any decision about the property required my signature. I asked her what that meant practically. She said it meant my son could not sell or transfer the house without me. I asked her not to contact my son's office, which she understood immediately. I spent the next week doing nothing differently. I made dinners. I filled the bird feeder. I responded to my son's texts about moving timelines with short, agreeable messages. I went to the TD branch in Oakville with Terrence's papers and my own ID, and I sat with an advisor named Glenn for 2 hours and came away with a full picture of what I had. Glenn was kind. He printed everything out and put it in a folder and asked if I wanted him to walk me through it again. I said, "Not today." Then I drove to a neighborhood I had never spent much time in, Leslieville in Toronto, where a friend of a friend ran a small property management company. I had called her the week before. I had a question that I didn't want anyone in my circle to know I was asking. I wanted to know what my options were. What followed was 3 months that I will not summarize quickly because they deserve their weight. I was not wealthy. What I had was a jointly owned house in Brampton worth At that point, somewhere around $800,000, a significant investment account, and a decision I had to make about what came next. I could sell the house. My son would have to agree to that. I could buy him out of his future expectations. I could do a number of things. The one I kept coming back to was simpler than any of those. I found a 2-bedroom condominium unit in Hamilton, a city that does not have Toronto's prices and does have a waterfront and farmers markets and a level of human decency that the 905 had largely squeezed out of itself. The unit was on the 9th floor. It had tall windows and a small balcony facing west and a kitchen with more counter space than I'd ever had. It was $312,000, which I could pay for in full without touching the investment account. I made an offer. It was accepted. I did not tell my son. I told him instead that I had found a place and was planning to move at the end of April. He seemed relieved. He offered to help with the truck. I said I had it handled. Chandra sent me a long message about how much she appreciated my flexibility and how she hoped we could still have Sunday dinners. I read it twice and then set my phone face down on the table. Moving day was a Thursday. I had hired a small crew, 2 men who had come recommended through the property manager in Leslieville. They were efficient and quiet and had my things loaded and unloaded in 4 hours. I left the bird feeder. I don't know why. Maybe because it was bolted in and taking it out felt like an argument I didn't have the energy for. Maybe because I wanted there to be one thing in that yard that had belonged to Terrence. I stood in the kitchen of the Hamilton apartment that evening with a cup of tea I'd made on the camping stove while the real stove was still wrapped in moving blankets. And I looked out at the lake and I thought, this is mine, not ours, mine. It took my son 3 weeks to notice that the house title had not transferred cleanly, that there were legal steps required that he had not anticipated. His real estate lawyer called Adrian's office. Adrian called me. She asked how I wanted to proceed. I said I would be in touch. I spent those weeks thinking carefully about what I actually wanted, not what I was angry enough to do, not what would have been satisfying in a made-for-TV kind of way, what I genuinely wanted. And what I genuinely wanted was not to spend the last third of my life in a war with my only child. But I also genuinely wanted him to understand that what he had done had consequences. I called him on a Saturday morning in early June. I told him I wanted to meet. He drove to Hamilton. I noticed the small discomfort in his voice when I gave him the address, the slight recalibration, and we sat at my kitchen table with coffee and with the paperwork laid out between us, and I told him what I knew and what I had done and what I was prepared to do. He was quiet for a long time. I told him that I was not trying to punish him. That was true. I told him that I needed him to understand that the way he had spoken to me in February, the 4 weeks, the coat still on, the assumption that my needs would simply reorganize themselves around his convenience had not been acceptable, that it had come from a way of seeing me that I did not intend to allow to continue. He said he hadn't meant it that way. I told him I believed him. I also told him that meaning well and causing harm were not mutually exclusive, and that at 63, I was no longer willing to absorb the harm in order to protect the good intention. Chandra had come with him. She had waited in the car, which I thought said something, though I wasn't sure what. At a certain point, my son went out to get her. She came in and sat down and was quieter than I had ever seen her. She had brought the baby, a boy, born in March, 6 weeks after I had moved out. He was asleep in the carrier on her chest. I looked at him for a long time. I told them both what I wanted. I wanted to be treated as a person with standing, not as a resource to be managed, not as a complication, not as a burden to be accommodated. I wanted to be consulted, not informed. I wanted to be invited to things, not slotted in. I wanted my son to call me because he wanted to talk to me, not because he needed something. And I wanted, in writing, an acknowledgement that the house in Brampton would be transferred to my son free and clear in exchange for a formal agreement about what our relationship would look like going forward, visitation with my grandson, communication, basic respect. Was it legally enforceable? Adrian had explained that some of it wasn't. But she had also said that the act of writing something down, signing it, witnessing it, changes things. It makes the implicit explicit. It makes it harder to pretend later that no understanding was ever reached. We sat at that table for 3 hours. My son cried at one point. I did not. I had already cried, alone, in the car in a parking lot behind a Shoppers Drug Mart on Main Street 3 weeks before this meeting, when I had finally let myself feel the full weight of what he had taken from me without ever meaning to. The cry in the car was for me. This meeting was for us. They signed the agreement in early July. Adrian notarized it. The house was transferred in August. My grandson is 11 months old now. I see him on the first and third Sunday of every month. My son drives the Hamilton, and we spend the afternoon here, in this apartment with the tall windows and the western light. Sometimes Chandra stays in the car for part of it and then comes up. Sometimes she stays the whole time. She is not a bad person. I want to be precise about that. She is a person who got what she wanted without thinking hard enough about who she was getting it from. That is a very common kind of harm. My son is trying. I can see it. It costs him something to drive here, to be in a space that is mine and not his, to offer opinions about, to ask instead of assume. But he is doing it. And the boy, Thomas, they named him Thomas, which was Terrence's middle name. And when I heard that I had to excuse myself to stand at the balcony for a moment, Thomas does not yet know any of this. He just knows the woman with the soft hands who always has raisins in the small bowl on the kitchen table. That is enough. For now, that is enough. I filled a new bird feeder last fall, a small wooden one I bought at the market on James Street. It hangs from the balcony rail, which is not ideal, and the pigeons are more interested in it than the sparrows, but it is there. Terence would have had opinions about the placement. He would have measured the distance from the railing and looked up whether pigeons counted as nuisance birds in a Hamilton bylaw, and then forgotten to actually do anything about it. I would have teased him for that. There is a version of this story that ends with me triumphant in some loud, visible way, with my son humbled and grateful, with the daughter-in-law chastened, with some sense of public accounting for what was taken. I understand why people want that version. I wanted it too sometimes, in the parking lot behind Shoppers, in the dark. But the version I have is this: an apartment with good light, a lawyer who answers the phone, a grandson who grabs my finger and holds on, and the knowledge, the specific hard-won knowledge, that I was never as powerless as I had been made to feel. That Terence had known that, and had made sure I would know it too, even from wherever it is he went. That is the whole story, and it is enough. I think about the bird feeder I left behind sometimes, not with regret, just as a marker of where I was and where I'm not anymore. There's something honest about leaving a thing bolted to a post in a yard that's no longer yours. It says, I was here, I mattered here, and I chose to go. What happened to me was not unusual. That's the part nobody tells you when you're in the middle of it. Women of my generation were raised to believe that selflessness was the same thing as love, that giving without counting was the highest form of devotion, and for a long time I believed that too. I poured 41 years into a life I thought was shared, and I never once asked what would happen to me if the sharing stopped. That wasn't love. That was an absence of self-knowledge dressed up as virtue. The cause of what happened is clear to me now. My son did not become someone who could ask his mother to leave in 4 weeks because he was cruel. He became that person because I had never once required him to see me as someone with needs of my own. I had been background, reliable, warm, always there background. And when you have only ever known someone as background, it genuinely doesn't occur to you that they have a foreground. That is the part I had to sit with. Not just his failure, but mine. The years I spent not asking questions about money, I had a right to understand. The times I said, whatever you think is best when I had thoughts of my own. The way I made myself smaller and smaller inside a life that should have had room for all of me. Terrence saw it. That's what the letter told me. Not in those exact words, but underneath them. He saw it and he compensated for it quietly because he loved me and because he didn't know how to say, "You need to take up more space." When I finally did take up space, when I called Adrian, when I drove to Oakville alone, when I made an offer on a Hamilton apartment without asking anyone's permission, something shifted that I cannot fully describe. It wasn't triumph, it was more like recognition, like meeting a version of myself that had always been there, waiting for me to stop apologizing for her. My son is learning to see me now. It costs him something, I can tell. He drives to Hamilton on those Sundays and he sits in my kitchen, with my light and my rules and my small bowl of raisins on the table, and he asks me things instead of telling me things. That is not a small change. That is years of habit being slowly, deliberately undone. I respect the effort. I do not pretend it erases the February morning with the coat still on. Both things can be true. What I know is this: the only way I was able to hold my ground was because I had, without fully realizing it, built some ground to stand on. Not money alone. Terrence gave me the money, and money without clarity is just a number on a page. What I built in those months between finding the envelope and signing the agreement was an understanding of my own situation, what I owned, what I was owed, what I was willing to accept going forward. That kind of understanding doesn't come from luck or from other people's goodwill. It comes from being willing to look clearly at your own life and ask hard questions about what you find there. Thomas grabbed my finger again last Sunday. He's at the age where he finds that funny. He grabs it and then looks at your face to see if you noticed. I noticed. I always notice. I just hope that by the time he is old enough to understand any of this, the story he knows about his grandmother is not the one about the woman who left quietly. I hope it's the one about the woman who came back on her own terms. That version is truer anyway.